Hey everybody, welcome back to Part-Time Tabletopper. My name is Adam and I am super excited to share this absolutely massive build that I have been creating for the past couple months. This started off as an order in my Etsy shop that somebody placed saying that they wanted to have essentially like a battle arena. And they shared a couple different ideas with me, and ultimately I got to use a little bit of creative license, went to the drawing board and came up with this. So I'm going to show you how I built this, as well as a couple new techniques I had to learn myself, which I hadn't found any tutorials for, so hopefully I can teach you guys something new. So without further ado, let's get into the crafting. So we're going to start off by making the base. We're going to need a 2 foot by 2 foot piece of plywood or MDF board, some 2-inch thick and 1-inch thick XPS foam, and a number of adhesives, including some wood glue, tacky glue, and especially construction adhesive. We're also going to need something to cut all of this with. I will be using a hot wire cutter, but an alpha blade or a hobby knife, or both, come in handy, as well as a straight edge. So this was the kind of build where I needed to do a lot of planning in advance. It was looking at different battle maps and designs that other people had made, some real-life arenas and colosseums, and then figuring out how I was going to cut out the different pieces of foam, assemble them, and put them in a way that looked like this fighting arena. So after unsuccessfully trying to hand cut a bunch of different circles in this 1-inch and 2-inch thick foam, I ended up deciding I needed to use my Proxxon. The problem that I had though was that my Shifting Land circle cutter only allows for a diameter of 12 inches. So this is what I invented. You can see over here, this is typically where it fits, but it only allows for that 12-inch thick diameter, so I needed to find a way to extend this out and cut bigger circles, and that's what led to this little contraption. I figured out that a 2-inch thick and 1-inch thick piece of foam were the exact right height because it's 3 inches tall, and then I just kind of roughly cut this out so that the circle cutter would fit in here and then taped it in to keep it secure. I could probably invent a bigger one in the future, but for now this works, and here is how it ended up working. It was beautiful. You'll see all of these different circle cuts that I made based on the measurements that I had mapped out from the beginning, and when I assembled them, they look like this. Admittedly, this step took me about a week to complete with a lot of trial and error, a lot of junk foam, until I finally got the cuts looking just right. I wanted to create an effect where when I put these pieces of foam on top of each other, it made steps for the bleachers. Now you can even see here, one of the things I did is in the 2 foot by 2 foot base, I wanted the fighting pit to be lower down underneath the bleachers so that it was actually lower than ground level, and you see I cut out a 12-inch square there. Now I'm just going to start gluing all of this together and you'll see how the final product looks. So I decided that I didn't just want this Colosseum to be a perfect circle. I did want to have some variation in the stonework. So I'm going to end up cutting it up into quarters and then creating these little divider pieces you see me just roughly cutting out here. I'm marking my cuts, creating lines, and these pieces, when they're done, are going to go in between the sections of the arena just to create some cool effects with the architecture. My hot wire knife ended up being a better tool to cut these into sections that I wanted, and then what I'm going to do here is take one of the scrap circles that I used from that base piece there and use that as a template to put this back into a perfect circle, and then I'm going to glue all of it together. This larger cutout here is where I'm going to be putting the Imperial box, as well as the hallway that's the entrance into the stadium. Now we get to start putting the stonework together. We're going to need a lot of different pieces of XPS foam, as well as possibly some dollar store foam board. This is just a very small sliver of one. They usually come in giant sheets, and I try to keep a lot of those on hand for projects just like this. I'm also going to be using a Shifting Lands pillar jig, which you'll see why in just a moment, as well as a hot glue gun, which is going to be your best friend when you're putting these bricks on. Also, speaking of Shifting Lands products, I'm going to be using this brick jig as well, just so that I don't have to cut out a bunch of individual bricks and lay them on the side. Finally, I'm going to use that hot wire knife a lot here too. Oh, and of course, the good old coffee tin with a lot of stones in it to texture the foam. So I'm going to take 4" by 1" by 1" strips of foam, put them into these pillar jigs, and then cut them out following the instructions. You'll see what I'm planning to do with these in just a moment. So this is what the pillars look like when they're complete, but I'm going to take this a step further and cut them in half. The reason is because I want the back of them to be perfectly flat so I can glue them onto the outside of the arena, just like you see here. Now that royal or imperial box is starting to come together right here. I'm going to end up cutting that out to be the hallway, which we'll get to in just a moment. You can see I used a stencil here to trace that arch because I didn't want to freehand it, and I'm going to add a couple pillars to this as well. I'm going to trace a number of arches and even spaces on the exterior of this just to continue to add to the unique architecture, and then I'm going to use a hot wire knife and a scraping tool just to kind of carve out a thin indent for all of those arches. After cutting out the hallway in that imperial box, I thought it might be fun if the doorway to get up there was in that hallway, so I just crafted myself a little door and I'm going to glue that in here. You'll also see me cutting out a lot of these for the rest of this project just to have some frames around all of the arches. So my plan for most of this build is to cut out bricks with the dollar store foam board as well as the XPS foam, but inside of these arches, because of how burnt they were and how indented they were, it actually ended up being easier to draw these parts in. So I'm just going to use a hobby knife here as well as a pen to draw some bricks into all of these arches. So speaking of those bricks, this is what the strips look like after you use that Shifting Lands brick jig. I just like using these because it's very easy to cut them out in strips and just stagger them to create a stone effect versus cutting out a ton of individual bricks. I'm all for time saving. So I've also just cut out some extra rectangles up here to put up there just to make some variation in the stonework. You'll see me doing that throughout this build, and I might not necessarily touch on every single piece. Here I'm going to be cutting out some stairs for the bleachers using a hobby knife. So for all of the cobblestone on the ground, instead of using the XPS foam, I'm going to use that dollar store foam board and cut those out into individual bricks and just lay them around to create a cool pattern. After doing the bricks on this, I think it's good enough to finally glue it on and make this one solid piece. Here you just see me taking some thin pieces of foam to create the rest of this Imperial box. It makes sense that whoever's up here would be enclosed and have some shade and protection from the outside elements, and so I'm just going to create some walls. Also, for that doorway I created down in the hallway, this is going to be the doorway for the stairs coming up. A friend who loves 3D printing who really helped me out here so I didn't have to craft those little dungeon doors. I'm just going to use these as the entrance to the arena for the people who are actually down there fighting. You'll see me just creating a little bit of an indent here and then gluing those doors in. Now, just planning ahead for an extra step that you definitely don't have to do, I'm putting some magnets in place around the top of this Colosseum because I want to take some miniatures and turn them into statues that I can take on and off if I ever want to decorate the Colosseum a little more. Now just more of me cleaning up the stonework. Anything that's on top that exposes the top of the bricks or the stones, I'm going to cut out pieces that fit there. I'm also showing you here in the back that I ended up drawing those bricks in just because trying to put them in from the shifting land jig covered up the door. And here's what it looks like when it's all coming together. This is also a good spot to point out that on the ground level, you can see that there's a cobblestone pattern traced into that XPS stone. I used a foam roller for that. Finally, I created a frame around the entire perimeter around the top of the Colosseum, as well as in the fighting pit, and then just an archway for that door in the hallway. So now for my favorite part, the painting. I'm going to start off with a base coat of black and then gray using some foam safe spray paint. I like doing this because it's a huge time saver and it also helps you get down into the cracks and the crevices between the bricks that are a little bit harder to do by hand. I started to spray paint the cobblestones here, but then I realized there were some cracks that I wanted to fill in with some drywall putty, so I'm going to come back to that later. Now, speaking of the stones, we're going to start painting individual stones with a khaki or sand color, as well as some other earth tones. I'm using some shades from Citadel just because I really like the effect it has combining with that base coat of gray, but you don't have to use those, you can just use basic acrylics for everything. We're going to dry brush all of that stone now. Using a really cheap, big makeup brush, we're going to take a sand or a khaki color, then a pale gray, and then a white to start raising the highlights on that stone and blending them all together. Then our final step here that really blends all of the stone together is using a sand wash that I handmade here, as well as some black, brown, and green at varying points. For some detail work near the end, I'm also going to very specifically use some Nuln Oil, and you'll see why. Now, shame on me for not filming it, but this is what the stonework looks like after I use that sand wash on everything. I did find that on the cobblestone pieces that are facing upward, like the ground ones, some of that sand wash getting lost down into the crevices made it look a little strange because the recesses were lighter than the highlights. So this is just me taking some brown or some black wash and just putting that on top of those pieces so that those crevices get dark again. After applying that drywall putty to fill in the cracks, I'm going back with some of that gray spray paint and just getting a base coat on all of those cobbles. Here's me just getting a really quick dry brush on all of those cobbles as well, using the same techniques we did for the other stone. Now, speaking of that Nuln Oil, I'm using that to go into every single crack or crevice of this build to really darken those shadows, which also makes the highlights that we've already created pop a bit better. So here's me doing something that I've never tried before. Normally I would paint the cobbles the same way I did with the other stones, but because it's such a large piece, I wanted to try to do something faster. Here I'm taking that sand wash and then watering it down even further with some water in a spray bottle, just to try and have it fall into all of the cracks and crevices, almost like a grout. Then after that, I'm just going to drop some black wash, brown wash, and green wash in varying spots to try and start blending it all together, which I'll use the water for again. So these washes were so watered down from how much water I put on that by tilting the board like this, I actually created some streaks. So now I'm gonna go add even more water to try and break those up and blend it. Now by doing this, it was so wet that you can see it starting to streak and pool. I had to use some paper towel to soak a lot of that up, but the finished product actually ended up being really cool, and I will likely use this for future large projects just like this. Oops, and I almost forgot to paint this door. And now for the final touches. I'm going to use a black metallic spray paint to paint those doors at the bottom of the arena, as well as using some Mod Podge and some grout and some Woodland Scenics fine ballast to create the sand, and then some spray adhesive to help hold it all down. Now this sifter right here is really going to help apply that grout, which you'll see in just a moment. Now, just as I do with all of my larger boards, I'm going to paint the edges black just to give it a nice clean look. And finally, here are some miniatures that I painted up in bronze and then magnetized so that I can put them around the Colosseum on those magnets that I placed earlier. And here is what it looks like all finished. that is how I built this absolutely massive fighting arena. I literally can't stop looking at it. This is definitely one of the more advanced builds I've done on my channel, and I actually have to get this in the mail today to get it out to the person who bought it, which is extremely bittersweet because I have grown very attached to this, and I'm very sad that I'm not the one who gets to keep it and play it. But the silver lining is that somebody else is going to get to wow their table with it, and that is a good feeling. But I hope you guys learned something. If you have any questions, just drop a comment and I'm happy to answer. I answer pretty much every comment that people make on my videos. And if you like the video, of course, give it a like because it helps other people find it. And if you want to learn about other cool tutorials that I have coming up in the future, subscribe to my channel and I'd love to have you a part of the community. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed watching me build this as much as I enjoyed making it, and I will see you at the next one. Bye.